But as we move into the afternoon session and definitely during the breakaway sessions, we want to take advantage of the fact that we have been fortunate to assemble a unique cadre of colleagues who are working on the subject of inclusivity, inclusive growth, inclusive markets, inclusive business, and this topic of our day, inclusive economies. So at the breakaway session, and we're looking forward to having your input. I'd also like to say that we really would like this to be not just a talk shop in the sense that we're looking throughout the 2 days to get some concrete ideas of way forward to achieve this. If you've been to many of our key fora on the continent and off the continent in the last few years, the topic of inclusion is one that permeates all of our conversations. We've been having unprecedented GDP growth on the continent over much of the past decade, but yet at the same time, our youth growth, and particularly youth who are out of high school, are in the labor field, has outstripped that growth. And so a lot of our discussion is about how do we address the challenge of youth unemployment? How do we address the challenge of trying to inculcate aspirations of entrepreneurship within our young people? How do we address the challenge of inclusion that involves domestic private sector companies as well? As Africa becomes very attractive to the global business community, in part because of the malaise in the economy outside, but also in part because of the growing middle class on the continent, the growing attention that we're giving to enablers of economic growth, such as infrastructure development, the population growth, the fact that by 2040, we will more than double the size of the continent and be at that time larger than China or India. We are becoming a marketplace also that investors recognize as one that gives high returns on investment. We have historically provided the highest returns for foreign direct investment, but that has also been coupled with often very high incidences of risk. But as we've undertaken economic reform across the continent, the risks have reduced. And so it's been much easier to recognize the value of investment opportunities on the continent. So as we unpack this discussion and we talk about, but how then do we translate our vast mineral wealth? How do we translate our vast tracts of arable land into opportunities, in particularly for the base of the pyramid citizens of the continent? We are pleased to note the ascension of people like Aliko Dangote and the expansion of enterprises like Nakumat into other parts of East Africa, ShopRite Checkers into all of Africa, the development of more than just EcoBank as continental financial institutions of note. But at the same time, the whole area of impact investing, of doing well and doing good, is rising as well. And so we're looking for a dialogue and debate. We're looking for models that can be shared amongst ourselves of what is happening so that we can replicate these models. We're looking for information on how to accelerate the trends that exist where you have these type of models here in Kenya, which is one of the hubs, if you will, for innovation on the continent, in the financial context, in the ICT context. How do we take those innovations to the DRC or take them to Gabon? You had here in Nairobi just last week a very interesting conference that was convened by the African Union, their private sector fora, and the topic of inclusive development, but particularly around energy, came up. How do we utilize independent power production and microgrids to bring electrification, which really, along with capital, becomes a lifeblood of enterprise on the continent. And the fact that our growth is outstripping our ability to provide consistent power to our companies is creating a challenge for us. How do we address that in an inclusive manner? How do we create value chains that allow us to bring in SMEs and MSMEs, either as distributors at the end of the value chain or as suppliers at the beginning of the value chain? A big focus in the last few years has been about how we use the fact that close to 70% of our population on the continent are somehow involved in the agricultural sector. How do we move farmers to create cooperatives or producer groups? How do we do, as was the case in South Africa where I'm based, you move cooperatives into listed companies, institutions like Capespan, which sell deciduous fruit to the north because they're off season, began as a cooperative called Unifrucro. How do we expand those opportunities, and where are the models to do so? Interestingly as well, how do we tap domestic resource mobilization? There has been, again, over the last few years, as we shift from Busan to a global partnership for development, a focus on mobilizing resources on the continent, financial resources. How do we utilize our pension capital more effectively? We have billions of dollars on the continent. How do we utilize our remittances more effectively? How do we also, coupled with the capital, tap the huge brain gain that we've enjoyed because of the diasporans who over the last 20 or 30 years have moved to markets where they're gathering information and knowledge that can be leveraged on the continent? How do we identify models where either you're a core, meaning that you're part-time in the marketplace, or you create linkages with academic institutions? These are all, again, subjects that we will talk about over the next few days. The area of R&D, again, many countries are looking to say, and I'll use the renewable energy industry as an example, we'd like to do more than just buy all of the technology offshore from Germany or from Asia. We'd like to assemble, we'd like to manufacture. Where we have rivers literally running through the continent, why can't we be best of breed producers of mini hydro technologies? Where we have some of the world's greatest abundance in terms of radiation of solar, why can't we be a global leader in concentrating solar power or photovoltaic power? What does it take from an R&D standpoint to get our research institutions, our think tanks engaged to move forward? We also want to talk about the policy environment, because often the biggest challenge, we can talk about inclusive economies, but we have to have our leadership also on that same page, that we are looking toward inclusion, and not party politics inclusion, but national inclusion. How do we also remove the barriers that exist and inhibit trade when we are trying to increase our regional integration? What are some of our good practice models on the continent of the 8 RECs that are the pillars of the African Economic Community, which the African Union is working toward and has been working toward since the Lagos Plan of Action? We still have barriers of movement of population, but it's changing. We have scenarios where in West Africa and East Africa, you can travel with an ID document as opposed to a passport. How do we change that? How do we create intra-regional sharing of knowledge? And how do we create sharing of knowledge that transcends language geography. So initiatives that happen in Francophone Africa, how are we sharing those with our colleagues in Anglophone Africa and Lusophone Africa? Again, these are all aspects of this challenge to move towards inclusive economies. The African Union has 8 very strong bilateral or regional partnerships. So you've got FOCAC with China, India, Africa, Africa, EU. How do we leverage those? Because when the international partners show up, typically they show up with many business persons in tow. They bring civil society to those engagements. But many on the continent are unaware that we even have the frameworks for those engagements because they include technology transfer opportunity, they include business linkage opportunity, they include capacity development components. But how do we capture those opportunities? And then again, what vehicles and methodology do we have to make sure that knowledge is also inclusively shared? And so that when you're talking about smallholders or you're talking about rural communities, how do we create linkages such that they're a part of this? Again, these are some of the challenges that we look forward to. And then how do we get our development partners, bilateral, multilateral, to support the initiatives that have been adopted by our heads of state? You talk about the Comprehensive African Agricultural Development Plan. You talk about the Program for Infrastructure Development in Africa. What are the inclusion components of these initiatives? How do we build institutions to bring our Pan-African chambers together so that they can interact with our heads of state? How do we create CEO roundtables of domestic African business so that they can become change agents and support these initiatives, become aware of these initiatives? Again, this is part of the path toward inclusion that we're hoping over these next 2 days that you will help us draft a map and a way forward. It's by no means the first time that we are collectively and probably individually talking about inclusion, but the inclusion economies, inclusive economies concept is a new twist on what we've been talking about over the last few years as inclusive growth, and looking at how do you start with inclusive businesses as the micro level. How do you get our corporate Africa to include, again, those smallhold producers, those unemployed young people, those domestic companies at a time when the world is increasingly using more technology. So we want to involve our labor, but it's impossible to retard progress. And progress comes with increased use of technology. So how do we also harness technology? How do we create an educational environment that, again, promotes entrepreneurship, that promotes vocational education, as well as getting a social sciences bachelor's? How do we raise the priority of informal business? Because many of the companies on the continent, the majority, are, there's a debate as to should we formalize those enterprises or should we just support the informal market where it stands? Again, amongst yourselves, amongst those who will join us on the dais, are some reflections on these questions that challenge our ability to achieve inclusiveness. We're a $1 trillion market now. We will get to close to 3 trillion in the next 25 years. That's a significant market. How do we harness that opportunity? And particularly as we're one of the regions of the world where we have regional economic communities, we trade the least with each other. But of note, what is exciting is that when you look at publications like Ernst & Young's Africa Attractiveness Survey, You have Poles on the continent emerging as investors. So you have Kenya in East Africa predominantly, you have Nigeria in West Africa predominantly, and you have South Africa among now the top 10 foreign direct sources of capital for investment on the continent. So we're encouraged as I give you a litany of some of the challenges related to inclusive market development, but we're encouraged by things that are happening as our markets are open, as the barriers to cross-border trade come down, as our skies become more open. So you see business people from all components of the continent traveling as much as you used to see development partners moving across the continent and foreign business persons moving across the continent. So as much as we say from a negative standpoint, Africa is not just one country, from an economic inclusion standpoint, from a regional integration standpoint, increasingly, our regions are becoming like a country. And continentally, we're having a cadre of professionals emerge who see the continent more like when they move from east to west, going from state to state, as opposed to I'm going overseas or I'm going to a place that is very distant. And as you have areas of the continent emerging as focal points, if you will, or learning labs for this knowledge, how do we connect them? So Kenya is one of those where you've got proliferating business tourism because of the aggregation of institutions that you find here. Increasingly, Addis Ababa in Ethiopia is becoming that kind of learning lab where institutions are there and there's knowledge there. Johannesburg is another. Abidjan in Cote d'Ivoire, because of the presence of the African Development Bank, will re-emerge as one, because prior to moving to Tunis, it was that. And Tunis, while the bank was there, became that, because you've got knowledge that is being packaged and developed, research that's being done. They're magnets for global good practice. And then those institutions that are there are now starting to disseminate information around the continent. This is the kind of knowledge that we'd like to have disseminate much farther than just in our research centers. You have finance work for Africa, where you've got research done on inclusive business that supports women. That is a major topic. I mean, I think we talk at every forum about how do we engage our young people? How do we bring both unemployed and undereducated youth, but also the increasing growth of college-educated youth? How do we bring them into the economy? Side by side with that, and we're glad that Dr. Geraldine Fraser-Molekete will be here to join us from the bank. She's the special envoy for gender from the African Development Bank, to talk about how do we maximize and harness the talent and resource and capacity to provide input both at home and in greater society of the continent's women. And so when we talk about inclusion, it is often about youth, but it has to be inclusive of our women. And I mentioned briefly the potential benefit of harnessing the diaspora, but that's another resource that we have. I mean, remittances now far outstrip the development assistance that is provided, but remittances typically go to family. How can we harness that so that the initiatives of the state also benefit diaspora bonds and use the fact that we have billions of dollars of capital flowing to the continent to drive our infrastructure development plan, for example, to fund our SMEs? Because frankly, in many countries, we're still grappling within our financial sector with the choice of putting our money in domestic government-backed initiatives or channeling our debt capital to more productive but much more risky initiatives in the private sector. And we're not winning yet. how do we bring our bankers, who are often skilled and trained to make loans to government portfolio institutions, along so that they can do a risk analysis on an energy project? How can we bring our policymakers along so that they can understand the more complex aspects of what it takes to create an environment where you can attract capital, for example, in the energy sector or in the infrastructure sector? So our inclusion is a knowledge-based one as well as an economic opportunity-based one. So I want to ask my colleagues, because all of that is to provide a bit of a sense of where we hope to go over the next few days. Our video clip, I'm now trying to reach our colleagues from AV in the back. Can you tell me if our video is available? Gentlemen, is our video available? Excellent. We're just going to draw your attention to the screens on your left and on your right. I'm not sure if it's possible to dim our lights at all. I think our head table dais lights cannot be, but hopefully everyone will be able to see the video. Okay, please. Just to let you know, as you might have heard, the band warming up, the president is very near. So if I stop too abruptly to hand over to the presidential MC, I just want you to know that is why. One of the particular highlights that I took from watching this film is that, and I mentioned to you the 8 different partnerships that the African Union has. As we talk about inclusive solutions on the continent, we should be aware that we don't have to work in isolation on the continent. I think one of the things that you look at, if you look at global good practice, and you look at what happened in India when there was a relationship with Silicon Valley and outsourced processing could take place in India, driven often by Indian Americans or Americans who hail from India, but the idea was to leverage the opportunities that existed. This example that we just saw in Kenya reminded me very much of that. And so as we talk about developing inclusive economies, we really should be, thinking locally and acting globally in terms of harnessing all of the relationships that exist between the continent and friends of Africa where they exist, and Africans who are based abroad to create these type of opportunities, because then we leverage the fact that we have a lower cost base on the continent, we have the available talent, with the fact that we have partners in other parts of the world who have larger pools of capital, and pools of capital that, because of our currency exchange rates, go farther on the continent. Those present huge opportunities for us to drive our inclusive agenda. I'm going to stop here because literally, as you can hear, the presidential procession will join us soon. Just a bit of housekeeping. I'm sure it's known to all, but when the president does come, we will all rise. So I'll stop there and ask you just to remain in your seats for a few minutes. So it's not a proper broad break, but it just allows us to segue to the formal part of the session this morning. Thank you. Colleagues, I've just been informed that though the president is not far, he's not as near as I had presumed. One of the other components of our 2 day initiative that we would hope that some, if not all of you, will utilize is our Twitter hashtag. We would like to be able to reach, just so that you know, this program will actually be live streamed um, by internet to colleagues who are not with us physically. But our Twitter handle, if you will, is Inclusive Economies 2014, hashtag Inclusive Economies 2014. And so we would invite you, and there's also our Facebook page so that you can post and we can have your inputs along with your poking feedback. We're looking to capture insights and key remarks that are made over the next few days via Twitter, via Facebook. And as I mentioned, because this will be live streamed, to get feedback from colleagues who could not join us here in Nairobi. And as I ask for your continued patience, I'll keep checking the pulse of His Excellency's arrival, but it's imminent, I'm sure. I am pleased to announce that the presidential motorcade has arrived. And so the president is really literally just outside and on his way in. So we will start our formal program very shortly. The president has entered the holding room and is greeting the other dignitaries and representatives of the organizations. And then when he has done that, you will proceed to join us.
Yes, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Uh, by now, we are aware His Excellency the President is with us at this venue, and anytime he will be joining us. I will request when the President comes in, we all be upstanding and welcome him warmly into this place. reminded us earlier, and I know we have to kindly manage our phones so that when the time comes, we move on very smoothly with little or no interruption at all. We would really appreciate that. We hope it will be a very quick function, quite quick. After that, His Excellency the President will have a photo session with the people seated here. So I will humbly request that when the time comes for His Excellency the President to leave, we be upstanding and we allow His Excellency and the people seated to move out to the photo session place, and we can follow after that. My name is Wanjohi. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and I will be working with you for this opening session. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, His Excellency the President of the Republic of Kenya. Tumkaribishe kwa makofi. We welcome him with a clap. Welcome, sir. And as we remain studying, I will request Madam Ruth Kagia. I will request Madam Ruth Kagia to join me here and lead us in a prayer. Madam, from here, kindly. From this podium, Madam Kagia.
Your Excellency, let's pray. Gracious Father, we come before you with thanksgiving in our hearts. We thank you that you've given us leaders who have got a vision, because we know that when a nation lacks vision, it cannot thrive. We thank you for our President, Uhuru Kenyatta, for his courage, for his wisdom, for his leadership of this country. We thank you for the thought leaders represented in this forum, people who spend time thinking about how we can advance this continent. We thank you for the theme of this conference about inclusive economies, inclusive development. We know that as a country, as a continent, we are as strong as our weakest link. And we focus on the weak links in our chain, in our economies, in our society, in our politics, and we put all this in your hands as we deliberate during this forum. We pray for wisdom, we pray for your counsel, because we ask all this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Your Excellency, ladies and gentlemen, please be seated. Your Excellency, Honorable Uhuru Kenyatta, President of the Republic of Kenya and Commander-in-Chief of the Defense Forces, Cabinet Secretary for National Treasury, Mr. Henry Rotich, Cabinet Secretary for Foreign Affairs and International Trade, Ambassador Amina Mohammed, the representatives of Rockefeller Foundation, African Development Bank, and the United Nations Commission for Africa, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, good morning and welcome to today's function. And with the gracious permission of Your Excellency, sir, I will now invite the Managing Director, Rockefeller Foundation, Mr. Mamadou Bitey, to make some introductory remarks. Mr. Bitey.
Your Excellency, President Uhuru Kenyatta, our chief guest, Mr. Henry Rotich, Cabinet Secretary for National Treasury, Mrs. Amina Mohammed, Cabinet Secretary for Foreign Affairs, members of government present, Mr. Charles Njoroge, Deputy Secretary General, East African Community, Mrs. Geraldine Fraser Moleketi, Special Envoy for Gender of the African Development Bank, Dr. Tachiwa Manu, Director, Social Development Division, Economic Commission for Africa, Dr. Zia Khan, Vice President, Initiatives and Strategy of the Rockefeller Foundation, Mr. Gabriel Negatu, Regional Director, Eastern Africa of the African Development Bank, Dr. Ebri Masal, Executive Director, Codesria, grantees, partners from all sectors represented here, members of the media, esteemed guests, dear RF colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, habari ya asubuhi. Good morning, bonjour. It is my sincere honor to stand before you this morning to welcome you at the Africa Forum on Inclusive Economy. Karibuni sana, as we say here. The Rockefeller Foundation has a tradition of convening, bringing together key partners and stakeholders to discuss and debate the critical issues facing the world, and discuss how we together can work strategically to achieve greater impact. This year, we are here to discuss one of the most critical issues globally and particularly in Africa: how to advance more inclusive economies on our continent. We are happy to share this forum with our valued partners, the African and the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, ECA. When I say to you that Africa is rising, it won't be news. Many of us have been proud to be part of that rhetoric over the last few years. And in many ways, that is true. Africa is the fastest growing continent in the world today. But it is also not news that this growth that we are so proud of is in hand with growing levels of inequality across the region. While our GDP is growing, poverty and inequality are increasing. In fact, according to the World Bank Development Group, 7 out of 10 of the world's most unequal countries in the world are in sub-Saharan Africa. So, what good is all this growth if it isn't shared among everyone, if the entire continent can't benefit? The goal of this forum is to discover why this growth is not being felt by all, and what each of us can do to change that, to address the barriers to inclusiveness in our own organizations, our own cities, our own countries, our own regions, and our continent. The Rockefeller Foundation is co-convening this forum with 2 institutions who are leaders around inclusive economies. The African Development Bank has launched last year a 10-year strategy based on 2 pillars: inclusive growth and green growth, with the goal of creating a more prosperous and sustainable Africa. As a major funder of resilience infrastructure and projects, the African Development Bank is in an important position to provide guidelines that guarantee inclusion and equity in the design, implementation, and future use of these projects. The United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, ECA, has developed a crucial and credible tool in this work that allows us to measure inclusivity. The African Social Development Index was requested by African member states to provide government leaders and other stakeholders with an Africa-specific index focused on measuring exclusion and inclusion as the 2 sides of one coin, while taking into account the specific context. You will be hearing a lot more about the ASDI over the next 2 days. While we wish Dr. Donald Kaberuka, President of the AFDB, and Dr. Carlos Lopez, Executive Secretary of ECA, could be with us today, we are thankful for their support as we planned this event and for the commitment that both of them and their organizations have made to the issue of inclusiveness in Africa. I would also like to thank the Council for the Development of Social Science Research in Africa, CODESRIA, which is our technical partner for this forum. We chose them to ensure that social science, research, and knowledge was a key part of our conversation. CODESRIA has been working with us to develop background papers on economic inclusivity in Africa, which will be shared with you. Thanks too to the Newmark Group, our logistics partner, for pulling all this together. Ladies and gentlemen, we also made a deliberate choice to have this event here in Kenya under the leadership of His Excellency Uhuru Kenyatta, who we have the honor of having here today. Kenya has seen significant economic growth. Kenya is known as the innovation nation, having developed products that have advanced financial and social inclusion using mobile and information technology. Kenya boasts a strong human resource capacity with one of the highest literacy levels in sub-Saharan Africa, and the country is a regional hub for education. Kenya's youth have been empowered through the numerous programs such as the Uwezo Fund to increase their access to finance and grow entrepreneurship, as well as recently the relaunched National Youth Service that enlisted over 2,000 young people. Kenya is a leader in the East African community, showing the way to growing an inclusive economy in multiple sectors. Kenya again exemplified its leadership and commitment to an inclusive agenda by being one of the 5 countries to pilot the ASDI and has lessons to offer to the rest of Africa on the subject of inclusive economies. We thank you, Your Excellency, for your leadership, which has enabled these and many other achievements. We are incredibly privileged to have the representation from many sectors, including academia, government, and the private sector here in this room, to ensure that our thoughts are guided by those whose lives we hope to impact. As we say here in Kenya, watu wa mashinani, we'd like to bring them into the room via a short video entitled Faces of Inclusivity. Again, I welcome you all here today, and I'm looking forward to working with you over the next 2 days to pave the way for building a more inclusive society in Africa. Asanteni sana, merci beaucoup, thank you all.
I welcome us to watch the screens, Your Excellency, sir, ladies and gentlemen, for the video. The faces of inclusivity, ladies and gentlemen. If it pleases Your Excellency, sir, I will now invite Madam Geraldine Maloketi, a special envoy on gender in the African Development Bank, to make some remarks. Welcome, Madam.
Your Excellency, Honorable Uhuru Kenyatta, President and Commander-in-Chief of the Defense Forces of the Republic of Kenya, honorable ministers, ambassadors, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, and very humbly, all protocol observed. My colleague has very well enunciated everyone, indicated everyone present. In the name of President Donald Kaberuka, President of the African Development Bank, I'm honored to welcome you to the Africa Forum on Inclusive Economies here in Nairobi, Kenya. Dr. Kaberuka, Mr. President, extends his regrets. It's the last 2 weeks of our board sitting, and we discussing the budget at the moment. And I think if he was absent from that board, we may have small challenges on this infrastructure rollout. And he asked if you could please excuse him because he's absolutely committed to this agenda and the issues that are being discussed, and wanted to be here, tried to be here up to the last minute. So you're here with second best, Vice President, Special Envoy on Gender, but inequalities and the whole issue of the inclusive agenda is quite critical to what we want to take forward. So I'd like to express our collective gratitude for you having honored us here by your presence amidst your commitments, because this speaks to the importance of today's events. We'd also like to thank our co-conveners, the Rockefeller Foundation and the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, for their commitment and dedication to ensure that this second forum brings light, we all hope, on inclusive economy, brought together in this room leaders and policymakers to not only identify and address the issues and to focus on help move Africa forward with the inclusive economies approach, but to ensure that we also look at the steps to make the implementation happen. And we need to do it for those we brought on the room, into the room through the video clip we saw earlier. The impressive levels of growth of African countries, both current and expected. And we know that 19 out of 30, the 30 fastest growing economies, as it's projected in the next 5 years, will be African. But we know that there are still persistent levels of poverty, as stated. Food insecurity and inequality is a problem that we will be dealing with, tasked to explore and find solutions to. Indeed, it's a daunting problem, but one that we must and can find solutions to, as the men, women, and children of this continent, to whom growth means so little, count on us to do. And that was stated in the voices earlier as well. So we must engage with how Africa invests in and promotes inclusive growth. We must look at how regional integration promotes inclusive growth and how the private sector can contribute to inclusive growth. The roles and responsibility of regional economic institutions, the private sector entities, governments and regulators alongside research institutions also needs to be addressed in order to find solutions to the issues at hand and to propose solutions to them. I have no doubt, the African Development Bank have no doubt whatsoever that insightful debates and exchanges will lead us to just that. I thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Your Excellency, sir, ladies and gentlemen, the Director for Social Development Division, United Nations Commission for Africa, Dr. Chachiwa Manu, will make some remarks. Welcome, Dr.
Your Excellency, President of the Republic of Kenya, Mr. Uhuru Kenyatta, Cabinet Secretaries present, members of Cabinet present, distinguished delegates from regional economic communities present, represented here today, Mr. Ziakan, Dean Fraser Moleketi, Special Envoy on Gender of the African Development Bank, Mr. Ziakan, Vice President of the Rockefeller Foundation, distinguished participants, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. I start by joining my colleagues in thanking warmly His Excellency the President for choosing to share valuable time with us here this morning as we begin this forum. On behalf of the UN Economic Commission for Africa, we are pleased to be part of the African Forum on Inclusive Economies, and I would like to express our sincere appreciation to the Rockefeller Foundation for taking the lead in organizing this Partners Forum, and to thank our colleagues from the African Development Bank and Codesria for their collaboration. I also bring you warm greetings from our Executive Secretary, Mr. Carlos Lopez, who is unable to be with us today, and extend his apologies for not being part of this forum. Excellencies, distinguished guests, as we reflect during the next 2 days on how to advance inclusive economies in Africa, I believe we should ask ourselves a key question. What does inclusive development really mean for Africa? Answering this question will help guide Africa to the future that we want for the continent. But I would like to incite your reactions around the proposal, which borrows directly from the words of our Executive Secretary. Inclusive development will be achieved when all our children have the same opportunity for survival, for nutrition, and for education. Equality will be achieved when our youth have equal opportunity for employment, when households are able to maintain their families free of poverty, and when our elderly can enjoy their golden years decently. It is in this context that we gladly welcome the opportunity presented by our colleagues from the Rockefeller Foundation to collaborate on work on building resilient cities and inclusive economies. It provides us a timely occasion to align our understanding, expectations, and roles in advancing inclusive development. Excellencies, distinguished guests, this forum has brought together policymakers, academia, civil society, and development partners from different organizations and countries to shape and align our approaches and leverage resources as we promote inclusive development in Africa. If Africa's 1.1 billion people, with a sizable youth component, were all to have access to quality education and skills, healthcare, employment opportunities, peace and security, food and nutrition requirements based on a modern agricultural sector, fueling industrialization with low carbon emissions and green growth, then this could go down in history as the greatest development of this era. These observations and recommendations present the benefits of inclusiveness for Africa's development. But of greater importance is the recognition that inclusive development is also a human rights and social justice requirement. Excellencies, distinguished guests, this proposal requires a deep transformation of the social and economic structures in our continent. It is important to note that to achieve this transformation, we need to ensure that a people-centered development path of recent UN history returns to the fore and becomes the kernel of inclusive development. I also have to stress the importance that data and information will have in this process of transformation of Africa. We are part of the generation that has been changed by knowledge. Today, we have a much better idea of what works and which policies and actions have achieved success both in Africa and beyond. We are better equipped than ever to move Africa forward, take actions to prevent the increase of inequalities in the continent, and build on our comparative advantages to make a significant improvement in people's lives. Excellencies, distinguished guests, while inequality is not unique to Africa, we know that exclusion in Africa is based on historical and numerous structural causes and forms a seamless interaction between income inequality and the correlates of poverty in Africa. As we have found out in Africa, the variation of progress towards the MDGs, for example, across income groups, location, gender, and ethnic groups attest to the multidimensional nature of exclusion. But there are no simple or straightforward solutions that would promote inclusiveness in Africa. The interventions that have been implemented or proposed all require integrated and multi-pronged approaches as well as various players. We applaud efforts from African governments committing themselves at the highest level to promote inclusive development. Many of our governments have put in place, reformed, and even implemented equity policies, complemented by fiscal policies to reduce exclusion and inequalities. These policies have taken the form of social grants aimed at job creation. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, as an institution that promotes economic and social development of African member states, the Economic Commission for Africa has prioritized inclusiveness for a number of reasons. First, as we have heard, Africa's unprecedented economic growth has not been sufficiently broad-based across sectors. Second, the continent's aspiration to reap the dividend from its youth bulge requires the inclusion of young people in development processes. And third, the cost of exclusion is extremely high and unaffordable for Africa now and in the long run. As an example, we can cite the cost of hunger in Africa studies that we have conducted in collaboration with the African Union and the World Food Programme, supported by the Rockefeller Foundation, I might add, which estimates that the economic impact of child undernutrition is between 1.9% to 16.5% of the GDP of the countries concerned. These are costs to the health system for children requiring incremental health attentions, for children who are repeating grades and dropping out of school, and for a significant proportion of the workforce that live with the lifelong consequences of malnutrition. Excellencies and distinguished guests, achieving inclusive development can be done in various ways. We can tap into current technological and non-technological opportunities as we promote inclusive development. Many of them are affordable, are creating jobs, and are widely accessible to wide segments of the population. And I just want to touch on a few. The media, for example, can be used as a powerful tool to instill and promote principles of inclusive development and as a tool for social and economic transformation. Already, the media has evolved rapidly in a way that it has been used to shape political views, social behavior, and identities. In particular, the role of social media cannot be underplayed in development processes, especially since young Africans are increasingly creating more platforms and using social media wisely. Innovation around technology and mobile phones, for example, can be used to strengthen development processes, including health, education, and political participation. The opportunities before us, many of which are also African bred, are immense and are yet to be used to their fullest potential in development processes. As I conclude, I would like to reiterate our commitment towards inclusive development and assurance that we will continue working with our member states and other stakeholders to ensure that the quality of life of the average African is improved. We will continue to propose alternative macroeconomic frameworks that align fiscal, monetary, and exchange policies towards long-term development outcomes of job creation, inclusiveness, and structural transformation of our economies. We will strengthen the capacities of our governments and develop tools such as the African Social Development Index, which will be presented and discussed in more detail during the course of the forum. And last but not least, monitor and report on commitments made to improve the livelihoods of Africans. As a knowledge generation institution, EC also will continue to work with academia, civil society, the private sector, and the media to ensure that the knowledge generated is effectively disseminated and used to influence decision-making at various levels. I thank you for your time and willingness to share your knowledge and to contribute to your experience and ideas. Thank you.
Allow me, sir, to now invite the Vice President, Initiative and Strategy, Rockefeller Foundation, Dr. Zain Khan, to make his remarks. Dr.
Your Excellency, President Uhuru Kenyatta, Mr. Henry Rotich, Cabinet Secretary for National Treasury, Ms. Amina Mohammed, Cabinet Secretary for Foreign Affairs, other members of the government present, our co-conveners from the African Development Bank and the UN Economic Commission for Africa, partners and grantees from all the sectors represented here, my colleagues from the Rockefeller Foundation, members of the media, esteemed guests, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. It is my great honor and pleasure to be here to address you today. I would also like to pass on a heartfelt welcome from the Foundation's president, Dr. Judith Rodin, who, with much regret, could not be here today due to other Foundation commitments. Let me start by sharing with you a brief history of who we are and what we do. The Rockefeller Foundation was founded in 1913. For more than 100 years, our mission has been to promote the well-being of humanity throughout the world. Today, we are pursuing that mission through two overarching goals. First, we want to build economies that expand opportunities for more broadly shared prosperity. And second, to build resilience to help people, communities, and institutions prepare for, withstand, and emerge stronger from acute shocks and chronic stresses. Together with partners and grantees, such as many of you here today, the Rockefeller Foundation strives to catalyze and scale transformative innovations, create partnerships that span sectors, and take risks that others cannot. Ladies and gentlemen, throughout our history, the Foundation has seen innovation and impact grow when we bring together actors and partners from different sectors and geographies so that we can learn, debate, and innovate to find solutions to the complex challenges we all face together. The power of partnerships and dialogue cannot be overestimated. And as a foundation, we strongly believe in the possibility to build on each other's ideas, to build on each other's successes, and to learn from each other's failures as well. We come together today with top thought leaders, decision makers, influencers from the public, private, academic, and development sectors to tackle the challenge of how to ensure inclusivity in a time of rapid and exciting growth in Africa. I can think of no better time or more urgent question for us to discuss. Inclusive economies is one of the Rockefeller Foundation's overarching goals, informed by the trends and challenges that we see globally in our work. The same global forces that create risk, volatility, and vulnerability also create unprecedented opportunity. Greater connectedness and information enables increased access to global markets that can expand productive potential and new options for broadly shared prosperity. Fortunately, innovations that were previously unimagined, such as mobile healthcare and banking, access to data, carbon-efficient technologies, and remote learning, are creating opportunities for people previously left out of the mainstream economy. At the same time, new business models and broader economic growth continue to lift up millions of people from poverty. But left unchecked, they can create unintended consequences such as accelerated inequality, social dislocation, and environmental degradation. Conventional wisdom presents these as trade-offs, the rate of growth versus the level of inclusion. We at the Rockefeller Foundation reject this either-or premise and believe these objectives can be both realized through new paradigms. Inclusion does not need to slow down growth, and in fact, a focus on inclusion can create new growth opportunities. This requires redefining how we measure economic progress, development, and human well-being in an unequal and resource-constrained world. Whatever pathway we use to foster development, it must respond to the varying needs of humanities, from the poor and most vulnerable in emerging economies, to the stagnating middle class in many developed countries, and to the youth bulge in many rapidly growing countries, a challenge that is Africa, where the number of youth aged 15 to 24 will double to 400 million by 2045. Yet, Africa's youth under the age of 25 represents 62% of sub-Saharan Africa's unemployed population, and nearly 3/4 of those live on less than $2 a day. It is clear that there's no shortage of challenges that we need to tackle, especially in Africa, but we believe that an inclusive approach will not only address lack of opportunity, but will aim to tackle problems at their root cause. Cultural and social norms, political institutions, and economic strata are the structures underpinning and reinforcing marginalization of the poor and vulnerable. Government policies, for example, monetary and fiscal policies, rights, trade rules, minimum wage laws, and social service provisions, are key determinants of a greater shared prosperity within economies. Business practices, including salary compensation, leave policies, business location decisions, are also critical. The Rockefeller Foundation seeks to inform and influence such policies and practices and break down the barriers to building more inclusive economies. Ladies and gentlemen, this brings me to the unique opportunity offered by this forum. The overall goal of this forum is to develop a common understanding on inclusive economies within the African context. We hope to spend the next 2 days engaging in influential dialogue and action towards greater impact around inclusivity on the continent of Africa. With that in mind, let me pose 3 questions that I hope will help channel and hopefully challenge your own thinking and drive greater dialogue around this critical topic. First, how can the poor and vulnerable benefit from an Africa that is on the rise, and how do we measure this inclusivity? Second, what are the implications and risks of Africa promoting growth that is not inclusive? And third, what factors are critical for the private sector to embed an inclusive approach in current and future business practices, and for governments to provide an enabling environment to accelerate the adoption of inclusive policies? The Foundation is looking forward to hearing your new ideas and innovations for advancing more inclusive economies in Africa. On behalf of myself, the Foundation's President, Judith Roden, and all of my colleagues at the Foundation, I welcome you to this exciting conference. I hope to leave here tomorrow afternoon with a greater sense of how we can all work together to harness the incredible growth in Africa and challenge it to create limitless opportunity for all. Thank you.
It is now my honor and privilege, Your Excellency, sir, to invite the Cabinet Secretary for National Treasury, Mr. Henry Rotich, to make his remarks and guide us to the next part of the program. Waziri, please.
Thank you, Your Excellency, the President and Commander-in-Chief of the Republic of Kenya. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Let me start by thanking you, Your Excellency, for finding time to join us in this joint forum of the Rockefeller Foundation, the African Development Bank, and the Economic Commission for Africa on inclusive economies in Africa. Again, it's my pleasure to welcome you here to this forum where the discussion over the next 2 days will focus on the needs of African people and seek to surface new ways in which we as the stewards of institutions, organizations, and companies should be forward-thinking in terms of addressing both equitable growth and prosperity that is shared among the majority of our population. Your Excellency, before I invite you to make your remarks, I'd like just to say a few words, maybe 3 points. One is something on the challenges and significant opportunities in Africa to boost inclusive growth. I'll also say something about our fiscal management and how it is helping in increasing inclusivity, and finally share with the audience some of the work we are doing in Kenya to boost inclusiveness. Your Excellency, on challenges and opportunities in Africa, let me say there are quite existing challenges in Africa, particularly on infrastructure. As you know, current estimates of infrastructure deficit in Africa is about 93 billion US dollars, of which 45, the current investment that countries are making is about 45 billion US dollars. There are indications that if we use more resources more efficiently, we can fill another 17 billion US dollars. Therefore, leaves a gap of about 31 billion. In Kenya alone, our infrastructure deficit is about 2 billion per annum. The other challenge remains is the low human capital, especially in education, the skill deficit, health indicators are still lagging behind, which is hampering competitiveness and economic performance. Issues of gender balance, weak governance, particularly in some resource-rich countries, which needs to be strengthened, strengthening the institutions so that you can improve governance. Of course, the issues of fragility and conflict still remains with us. Opportunities, as you all know, this is the continent on the rise. The structural transformation that we are undertaking, and which most countries are actually already doing, will definitely help to create jobs, with, of course, the cascading effect on positive impact on poverty and growth. Of course, the continent also has the youngest population, and of course, we have to work so hard to increase the demographic dividends by increasing the productivity of the young people. Issues of urbanization is still, Africa has the fastest urbanization rates, and we need to plan our urban towns to increase expansion. Of course, the opportunity also with the significant natural resources that is available. 22 countries in Africa are resource rich, and utilizing these resources better will definitely help in boosting inclusive growth. So on the issue of fiscal management and achieving inclusivity, let me mention that one critical issue is really how we manage our taxation system. We need to have our taxes to be more progressive. For example, redesigning our VAT laws to limit exemptions that benefit usually the rich, while ensuring that items consumed by the poor are exempt. I'll say something on what we've done in Kenya. On the expenditure side, issues on increasing access of low-income families to education is a very efficient tool for boosting equality. Of course, not to mention improving the access of the poor to healthcare services is also key. Social transfers are very critical. Better targeting them to the beneficiaries is definitely going to boost inclusivity. So let me end by saying what we've done in Kenya, particularly on the taxation front. We have reviewed our VAT law to make it more progressive, removing exemptions and targeting items that are largely consumed by the poor. We have also commenced the review of our income tax to make it more progressive. Currently, individuals earning less than 10,000 Kenya shillings are not eligible to taxation. Our excess tax, which is again we are reviewing, is only levied on luxurious goods such as alcohol and cigarettes. We're increasing infrastructure, which is key for growth. As they say, it's important to grow the pie so that you can achieve increased distribution. So infrastructure is key for us in terms of growing economic growth in Kenya. We continue to provide free primary education, free secondary tuition, bursaries, loans for higher education. We also have interventions under the health sector, free immunization, free maternity care, free distribution of malaria nets, and spending on HIV and yes, HIV and other malaria related diseases. We have increased spending on that, particularly working in the Global Fund. On access to credit, Kenya is still a leader on this. Over 70% of Kenyans now are financially included, particularly in the formal sector, thanks to the revolution in M-Pesa, which has been very helpful to increase activity in the banking sector. There are other interventions to do with the Youth Development Fund, the Ways of Fund, the Women Enterprise Fund, and of course, the cash transfers that we have increased over the recent past. We have also reviewed our procurement to allow for 30% contracts to the youth, women, and the persons with disability. This has also been very critical in achieving inclusivity. So, Your Excellency, this forum will focus on the theme on inclusive economies. As you know, inclusive economies is one of the most complex challenge, how to ensure that young people have access to both employment and entrepreneurship opportunities. The challenge becomes even more complex for women and those with disabilities, and as such, inclusion has to be approached with a wide view. Any approach that seeks to address this issue has to look at both the social issues and economic indicators. Today, we have here some of the best minds this issue from Africa and beyond, who will be sharing the practical and tested methods of addressing exclusion. We look forward to the outcomes of the deliberations of this meeting that will be critical in unlocking practical ways in which we, together with the private sector and the academic community, can be active collaborators in this endeavor. So with those few remarks, it's my great honor to invite His Excellency the President to officially open this forum. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Please, let's be seated. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, let me begin by thanking all the organizers, indeed, for their excellent work in convening this forum. And indeed, I and my government share their conviction that we can develop a common understanding of the opportunities and agenda for inclusive economies in Africa, and that we can encourage new practices of inclusion and equality on the continent. Africa, indeed, is at a crossroads, with a youthful population that will be the largest global workforce in the next 2 decades. We are a land blessed with natural resources beyond compare, and a continent that is the very embodiment of resilience and hope. Before us stands opportunity for our people, our nations, and our future. Behind us, a past in which we have not always lived up to the highest expectations of our people. In the last decade, developing and least developed countries were spurred by the Millennium Development Goals. The attainment of these goals by 2015 has been imperative for us. In this regard, African countries are playing an active role in leading and advancing discussions on the post-2015 development agenda. Kenya is currently co-chairing the Open Working Group on Sustainable Development Goals, which is steering the dialogue on the post-MDG agenda. These goals will play a vital role in shaping development thinking in years to come. Indeed, I'm also glad to note that Africa is the first region in the South to have developed a common position on the post-2015 discussions, which emphasizes structural economic transformation, inclusive growth, and environmental sustainability. Africa's own growth agenda is now at the very heart of the international development practice. We as African leaders are working more closely than ever before with our continental institutions. We have defined and committed ourselves to the establishment of building blocks for a future that is critical for our continent's growth. We identify that investment is multifaceted, human-centered, future-focused, and sensitive to both intrinsic and unlocked value of our human and natural resources. This approach, I believe, is the very bedrock of what an inclusive economy is typified by expanding economic opportunity for the majority of our nation's population and leveraging on the society's assets in order to increase the overall well-being of our people. Ladies and gentlemen, today the most significant challenge confronting the world and to our continent is indeed the challenge of inequality. But Africa's narrative is now changing. The impressive economic potential and prospects has brought about a greater sense of optimism in Africa. The continent, Africa, has over the last decade become one of the fastest growing regions in the world, and as has already been stated, with 8 out of the 10 fastest growing economies being in Africa. In 2013, Africa maintained an average growth rate of about 4%. This in comparison to 3% growth in the global economy. Further, Africa's average growth is projected to accelerate to close to 5% in 2014, 6% in 2015, thus to levels last seen before the onset of the 2009 global recession. In this regard, Africa is standing in an incredibly privileged position, being a center for global growth. We are proudly watching the continent rising to be an international powerhouse and becoming an investment destination for both advanced and emerging economies. Indeed, it is no surprise that frontier economies such as Kenya, Uganda, South Africa, Nigeria, and Botswana are roaring loud as the African lion. And yet the tide of growth is rising at an incredible pace, and Africa is yet to fully reveal herself. In the last decade, foreign direct investment to the continent has increased fivefold, with the largest share of that investment flowing into the mining and extractive sectors. As African countries, our focus should now be on developing a skills base that is reflective of the opportunity that rapidly growing sectors hold. As we develop our future workforce, we must start thinking more broadly about our educational investments that will cement our growth in years to come. It is important that we harness the skills and the expertise that is critical to growth and development. Engineering skills to run drilling operations, legal skills to negotiate positions that protect our present-day assets into the future, technology skills to run the digital networks that are needed to monitor, and outstanding vocational skills to build and maintain these assets are critical to our economic and intellectual maturity as nations, and to economic and livelihood prospects for our young men and women. Here in Kenya, we have re-energized our National Youth Service as a program that instills dignity in all spectrums of work, embeds national values and social cohesion as a benchmark for a new generation of young Kenyans, not only impacting the servicemen and women of the National Youth Service, but also the communities that they serve. Further, Africa is rapidly growing its digital footprint, and Kenya has established itself as a leader in the field of IT innovation with groundbreaking inclusion products such as M-Pesa, Ushahidi, putting this country on the global map. My government is committed to ensuring it reflects a digital DNA, and this is evidenced by our commitment to building these skills from primary level and shifting the modus operandi of how government works through an e-government platform. Our Huduma centers have been established to accelerate service provision to citizens through e-service. Such commitment has been actualized by our partnership with the Rockefeller Foundation through their Digital Jobs Africa initiative, whose goal is to connect high potential but disadvantaged youth to jobs in the digital economy. Through this partnership and in collaboration with the private sector, high school graduates from Nairobi's formal settlement undertook digitization of medical records at Kenyatta National Hospital, the country's largest referral hospital, and the digitization of judicial records in partnership with the National Council for Law Reporting. This initiative not only made these legal records available digitally, but also converted the records into formats accessible to the visually and hearing impaired, thereby providing access for an often excluded segment of the population. Ladies and gentlemen, this multi-impact approach builds jobs for our youth, who may not have been absorbed into employment, and enables citizens quicker access to their information, enables companies to have triple bottom line value, and improves the skills of these young people through on-the-job practical experience that enables them to move up the employment chain. It builds on the significant growth of ICT infrastructure that has taken place across the continent and leverages what is perhaps our continent's greatest asset, a talented youth population and our own demographic dividend. Moreover, this approach exemplifies new thinking by challenging employers to embrace inclusive hiring as a sound business practice, extending opportunities to those who might otherwise have been excluded. In 2013, we launched the UWEZO Fund, which is aimed at enabling women, youth, and persons with disability access finances to promote businesses and enterprise at the constituency level, understanding that jobs are also self-generated. Entrepreneurship is a key driver of our overall growth. In addition to Kenya, this approach has currently been deployed in Ghana, South Africa, Nigeria, Egypt, and Morocco, and has resulted in thousands of jobs. Our next frontier should be focused on how to replicate these multi-impact models in a variety of sectors, including infrastructure development, natural resource management, health, conservation, and agriculture. Ladies and gentlemen, turning to agriculture, we recognize that this is still the backbone of many of our economies, supporting 90% of basic livelihoods across the region and the continent. And yet food insecurity and improved livelihoods remain elusive for many of our nation's citizens, evidenced by the fact that 70% of Africa's poorest are engaged in agriculture. Moving towards systems that are farmer-focused and that ensure highest value returns along the value chain, while maximizing the incomes derived from the producer of that good, has to be the future of our agricultural approach. Innovative and human-centered models that meet the income aspirations of our farmers, while allowing our children, families, and communities to benefit from proper nutrition, which we know yields outsized productivity benefits for every shilling spent. This should be the way we approach our investments in this sector. I am glad to note that one of today's panel discussions focuses on the symbolic partnership between consumers, producers, and buyers in agriculture, and how the value chain can be enhanced for all. Keenly informed by both successful and not so successful practices that have been employed in the past. Let me move on to infrastructure, where my government is paving the way in opening up regional trade across the continent, understanding that nations are intrinsically co-joined in their regions and have a responsibility to that relationship. Recently, we in Kenya flagged off the joint South Sudan-Ethiopian transport corridor, which will spur regional and economic inclusion for the people of this region. Trade integration is essential for Africa to realize its full economic potential, to participate in the global economy, and to share in the benefits of an increasingly connected global marketplace. Having 54 individual countries, often without the physical and economic machinery to act in tandem, significantly limits optimization of this opportunity. Regional bodies can shoulder this responsibility of strengthening an integrated and economically diverse Africa to include young and old, women and men, rural and urban communities alike, to firmly establish our continent as a premier global emerging market. Ladies and gentlemen, while progress towards inclusivity may seem a difficult goal to measure, new African-centered approaches have now been developed that are reflective of our interest, intellectual input, and continental goals. As part of our commitment to be a beacon on the continent, Kenya was a pilot, along with Cameroon, Morocco, Senegal, and Zambia, in the recent launch of the Africa Social Development Index, developed by the Economic Commission for Africa, in collaboration with the Ministry of Devolution and Planning, the Kenya National Bureau of Statistics, and the University of Nairobi. The index will enable us to assess the actual extent of exclusion and inequality in our nations by measuring human exclusion and assessing our performance towards inclusion development along the entire life cycle. We are honored to be part of the first phase of this pilot, knowing that lessons learned from here will be used to strengthen the application of the index. I encourage the other 49 countries on the continent to rapidly adopt this tool as a way to set targets and monitor their own progress with regards to inclusivity. Ladies and gentlemen, as you engage today, my challenge to you is to be proactive, to be bold in your thinking, and to have an open mindset so as not to reinvest our scarce resources in approaches of yesteryear that have not yielded optimal results for our people. But most of all, to think about our continent's future and how, in your individual and institutional capacity, you are contributing to a higher quality of life and a better future for the multitudes whose voices are not present in this room. After all, we are not inheritors of this land, but keepers for the generations of Africans yet to be born. Indeed, with these few and many remarks, it is my pleasure to declare the inaugural joint forum of the Rockefeller Foundation, the African Development Bank, and the Economic Commission for Africa on Inclusive Economies in Africa officially opened. I thank you and I wish you great deliberations. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Your Excellency. The partners in the organization of this forum would most humbly wish to request to have a photograph taken with Your Excellency outside. And I request the rest of us to be upstanding as His Excellency the President leaves at his pleasure.